that just points the whole question to the issue of attrition, right? Which is, if you're going to be stuck in those places, whoever wins is the one that is able to last longer, the one that is able to project more significant losses on the other party. And I think that's where, perhaps I'm a little less pessimistic than some in the way that I do see the Russian military taking severe losses. And even though they have very significant reserves to keep replenishing that, the fact that they are losing artillery systems, armored vehicles, personnel at a insane rate, really, rates that we actually haven't seen in warfare since the Second World War. So this is something that I think has to play to the advantage of Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with military analyst Sim Tack. Sim, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
I want to start with where we are at the moment in terms of this conflict. On Monday, we heard that Ukrainians were able to shoot down a Russian early warning aircraft over the Black Sea. One of the first times that Ukraine has been able to hit this sort of target. How significant would you say that is?
Well, I think it's relatively significant. In one way, taking down one of these aircraft, of which Russia has several more, of course, isn't going to completely turn around the course of the war in any way. But it does put some severe restrictions on Russia's ability to use these kind of aircraft in the future. So now that they've learned that the Sea of Azov is not a safe operating environment for these kinds of aircraft, they're going to have to pull them farther back, which is going to limit their range, their effectiveness in areas deeper into Ukraine. So I think it's definitely a very important occurrence. Essentially another way that Ukraine is able to chip away at some of those Russian capabilities, hopefully reducing the pressure on their forces on the ground.
And I suppose it feeds into the narrative around Ukraine's success in the Black Sea, really, since the start of the conflict.
Exactly, and in a very same way, it's what I was talking to someone else about earlier and calling them strategic counters, right? Where they're not necessarily operations or actions that are directly impacting the front line or where the front line is, but being able to push away these A-50 AWACS aircraft, or being able to push away the Black Sea Fleet, which limits Russia's ability to go and launch calibers or resupply forces in Crimea. All of those things kind of help suppress Russia's overall capabilities.
And if you're Vladimir Putin, not the start to your re-election year that you'd have been hoping for.
Most likely, but I think realistically he should have expected something to go wrong. That's been the trend for the past few years in some ways. So don't think he expected 2024 to go really radically different.
Let's talk about Russia, because Russian sources claim they're preparing a new ground offensive in the coming weeks as the ground freezes more in southern and eastern Ukraine. I mean, does Russia have the capability at the moment, Sim, to successfully execute new ground offensives?
They do and they don't. Essentially, that depends on how you want to define a counteroffensive, right? If we want to define a counteroffensive in the same way that we expected a certain type of counteroffensive from Ukraine in the summer of last year, I don't think that's on the table, right? So massing large armored formations to open up a division scaled front line somewhere for an offensive, I don't think we'll see that happen. Now, what we have seen Russia do over the past year, more than a year now, is continually put pressure on certain parts of the front line by pushing personnel and equipment to the point where they will make those small advances. And Russia's actually been doing that in the past months as well, in Avdiivka specifically, where they are sacrificing a lot of personnel and equipment, but they are making those limited gains on the ground. And little by little, they do get closer to conquering a place like Avdiivka. So could we see things like that, either a reinforcement of what's happening in Avdiivka, or maybe Russia will try again in an area like Kupiansk or somewhere else along the front line? I think that's very likely, and that's kind of the strategy that Russia has been bound to, essentially massing forces and trying to keep pushing that front line regardless of the sacrifice that it requires. But in the sense of what in the West we would call a real counteroffensive or offensive operation, I don't think the means or required coordination for something like that is there.
And Sim, are you among those who would argue that Avdiivka falling to the Russians is now increasingly inevitable?
I'm not sure if inevitable is the right word. I think it is possible that it will happen. I think if it happens, we also need to understand that while it is a very significant symbolic loss, Avdiivka has been one of the places that has been on the front line of this war since 2015, long before the more recent invasion in 2022. So the fact that Ukraine would be pushed out of Avdiivka, it'll definitely have some kind of impact on morale and things like that, on the way the media, of course, is talking about the conflict. But in a very real sense, whether Ukrainians are positioned at Avdiivka or 10 kilometers to the west, I don't think that makes a huge difference in how the war is actually being fought.
Has Avdiivka lost its strategic significance over recent months? Because essentially the town has been reduced to rubble almost. I mean, 6 months ago, people would argue because of its proximity to Donetsk, it carried more strategic significance than, for example, Bakhmut did, when there was a lot of focus on Bakhmut. But now, does it still carry the same strategic significance?
Well, I think the significance of Avdiivka hasn't necessarily changed, but that begs the question, what was its original significance, right? And I think that significance is primarily derived from the fact that it was on the front line. It was one of the locations where Ukraine was holding back that Russian advance, meaning not only that it is denying Russia control over this village, but more so that it is denying Russia the ability to break through, to expand far beyond Avdiivka eventually. So in a way, I think the nature of the strategic value of losing Avdiivka is defined more by how well Ukraine is able to hold back Russia after it loses Avdiivka than the fact that it is being able to hold them back in Avdiivka or not.
Where do you think we should be looking next? Do you think we will see a new location on the front line become, as it were, the new Avdiivka, if Avdiivka became the new Bakhmut? Is there somewhere else we should be looking?
I think that's a bit of a guessing game. The reality is that any location along the front line has kind of a similar level of importance at this point. Both sides seem to be very focused on just making sure that the other side is not able to break through and significantly change where that front line is. So whichever place Russia or Ukraine chooses to conduct one of these offensives, that is the place that at that point becomes important.
And how would you rate the prospect of either side making a significant breakthrough in the coming months, Sim? I mean, it feels like we're in this very positional phase of the war with neither side making any significant gains. I mean, we spoke about Russia's hopes to launch successful ground offensives potentially, but do you see any realistic prospect of either side making significant breakthroughs in the next couple of months?
I think at this point it's difficult to see how that would materialize. I'm still hopeful that on the part of Ukraine, with some of the new capabilities that might be coming in 2024, as well as perhaps lessons that they've learned in the summer of 2023, that they might be able to mount something that could result in that. But the reality is that the way that the front line has been shaped right now, the way that forces have been massed along that front line, the extensive use of mining along the front line. I saw a statement, I think last week from Budanov as well, where he said that the use of drones by both sides is actually something that is massively suppressing mobility along the front lines as well, because it's difficult to move around without being spotted and targeted by these drones. So there's a lot of things at play that are limiting the ability to actually mount something similar to mobile warfare or maneuver warfare, as we call it. But that just points the whole question to the issue of attrition, right? Which is, if you're going to be stuck in those places, whoever wins is the one that is able to last longer, the one that is able to project more significant losses on the other party. And I think that's where, perhaps I'm a little less pessimistic than some in the way that I do see the Russian military taking severe losses. And even though they have very significant reserves to keep replenishing that, the fact that they are losing artillery systems, armored vehicles, personnel at a insane rate, really, rates that we actually haven't seen in warfare since the Second World War. So this is something that I think has to play to the advantage of Ukraine.
That's really interesting. Can you just expand a bit on that, Sim? Because there is a sort of developing narrative that where we are in the conflict at the moment favors the Russians and favors Vladimir Putin, maybe from a political viewpoint more than a military viewpoint. But what you just said there about Russia's ability to replenish its supplies is really interesting. Can you just tell us a bit more?
Of course. Well, so first of all, when we're talking about the conflict going into the direction of Russia or Ukraine, it is very important to focus that on that being the now, right? When we're talking about some of the future challenges that Ukraine is facing in terms of support that they are getting from the West, several elections that are going to be happening in the West, including the UK, as well as in possibly in Ukraine, those are going to affect Ukraine's ability to continue that. But on the Russian side, we're not foreseeing any kind of radical change there. The reality is that Russia's defense industry has been able to catch up somewhat with the conflict. So production of artillery has been ramped up. Some say that has come at sacrificing quality. Russia's been able to tap into supplies coming in from North Korea, especially the artillery munitions, but even some of those ballistic missiles that we saw launched recently. So Russia is doing a lot to try and keep fueling its conflict. But at the end of the day, what you're going to need to sustain these kind of operations is people. They're going to need to actually be able to recruit people. We've seen Russia at several times changing the rules for their recruitment, essentially recruiting older people, recruiting people with certain disabilities that they weren't recruiting before. And there's a lot of talk about Russia having to eventually mount a new round of mobilization, something that they've been putting off because it's a very unpopular thing to do. And I think especially with Putin's re-election campaign that you referred to earlier, that's probably a reason that they're not too excited about launching this kind of a mobilization right now. But perhaps after those elections, once Putin's position has been secured again in public perception, they might be able to do something like that. But that again is going to bring an extra burden of political tensions. And of course, I know I'm really stringing this answer along here, but then there's also the question of those forces being recruited and then being brought to the front line with very limited training, limited equipment, and essentially not as effective as some of the forces that Ukraine has been able to have trained in the West and brought to the front line at a near NATO level of proficiency, I would say.
And I've heard the argument, Sim, that on drafting new recruits to the front line, the thing that Putin is worried about having to do, but he may well have to do this at some point, is recruit people from the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which, if there is going to be any potential move against Putin, is probably where it's going to come from.
Exactly. And that's a very sensitive issue in Moscow. So some of the recent changes actually that we've seen in the recruitment policy, focusing on certain disabilities and diseases that used to get people out of serving, now causing people to serve, as well as some changes in the rules about labor migrants being recruited into the military. So in the past, Russia's been recruiting Russians from the outer territories, if you can call them that. But now they're also targeting labor migrants that actually have dual citizenship. And Russia's now saying, well, if you have this Russian citizenship, it turns out it actually comes with the duty to serve in the Russian military. So they're trying to really gather everything that they can without having to touch the Muscovites and keep the war going without too much resistance. But eventually, I think that reserve is going to have to tap those Muscovites, or Russia will have to significantly scale down operations And then, of course, that is the point at which Ukraine could actually be in a pretty good position in that conflict.
You mentioned a moment ago, Sim, the significance of drone warfare at the moment in the conflict. How would you rate the success of Ukraine's air defences at the moment? Because we know that Russia are continuing to target the big cities.
So I think the air defenses are relatively effective. You can't expect 100% effectiveness from these kind of weapons, of course. Ukraine's air defenses are also stretched among multiple different missions. They have their missions along the front line where obviously the taking down of the A-50 occurred. Some other aircraft recently have been taken down near the front line as well. And then you have your other air defense systems that are deployed more towards those strategic assets around Kiev, around some of the power plants, around some of the industry deeper into Ukraine. So the fact that Ukraine has to spread around this air defense means that naturally there will be gaps to certain systems. One of the most important things there, though, is that Russia's ability to actually maintain these kind of attacks has been troubled as well, where they've only been able to mount these kind of missile attacks that are able to overwhelm the air defenses at a very, very slow interval with several months in between. So for that reason, I think the Ukrainian air defense has been focusing more on its capability against some of the systems that are more readily available to Russia. So, for example, the Shahed drones originating from Iran, but of course also produced inside Russia now. But those kind of drones, they are more readily available to Moscow. So focusing on being able to take those down effectively, and that seems to be working quite well when you look at the statements and the places where there are impacts. That removes a lot of the risk that Russia can pose. But of course, on the other end of the spectrum, attacks using the Kinzhal missiles, the Caliber cruise missiles, those do still appear to be getting through that net at some point.
And what are the latest tactics we're seeing from Russia in terms of trying to penetrate Ukraine's air defenses?
So specifically what we saw in that last series of attacks is I think exactly what we're just talking about, the fact that they are trying to mass the use of different systems together to try and overwhelm those air defenses. When you launch multiple systems, the Ukrainian air defenses are going to have to prioritize which systems are easier to take down. They'll take those down first because there's more certainty that they can actually have some kind of an effect on the damage that is prevented. So that's kind of the pattern that we've seen Russia using now. They are stocking up on these systems as they produce them, as they obtain them from abroad, and then they try to launch them together in a short period of time to maximize the amount of them that actually comes through.
Let's talk about the situation with military aid for Ukraine. How critical is the situation becoming? The impasse in Congress in the US continues. The EU has been repeatedly failing to meet its targets for military aid, in particular. I think its target of 1 million shells a year. It's way off meeting. How critical is the current situation?
So I think that situation is really the hinge upon which the entire conflict is pivoting right now. Right, the situation for Ukraine is not looking good in that regard. There's a lot of reports, a lot of claims of Ukrainian artillery units having to actually ration their use of munition, which is bad, right? You cannot maintain sufficient pressure on the Russians or achieve the level of attrition that you would be able to achieve if you had plentiful stocks of ammunition. So one way that is really dramatically bad actually is if you look back at the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, because what actually happened there is even though Ukraine was not able to achieve their massive breakthroughs and push close to the Russian border in any place, what they did achieve during that counteroffensive is they obtained an artillery advantage for the first time in this entire conflict. So up until that point, for each Ukrainian gun that was firing, there were multiple Russian guns firing back, which means that you have very limited ability to to move around, remain undetected without being targeted by that artillery, it makes life very difficult, right? So in the summer of 2023, Ukraine was able to turn that around, and that's why since then, if you look at the public figures on how many Russian artillery systems are destroyed on a day-to-day basis, that number has gone up significantly, as well as other systems that are being targeted by artillery, of course. But essentially, that kind of pressure that they've been able to put on Russian operations at that point, that is now at risk of being completely lost because the Ukrainian artillerymen are having to ration their artillery shells. Now, in the West, in NATO, people are doing their very best to actually keep up with that. And I think if you look at the figures that are coming out of the producers of these ammunition, such as the German company Rheinmetall, they are scaling up their production lines. By 2025, they'll be able to produce at a level where they can fairly easily, it looks like, produce 1 million artillery shells for Ukraine per year. Of course, that's still a long while away. We've got an entire year to go through, and we're seeing, Germany put some smaller orders out here and there. I think at this point, with the ammunition that's been delivered, plus those that are still on order for delivery in the next few months, I think it's only been up to 600,000 of the 1 million artillery shells that would be delivered. So that's quite a significant shortfall. And then finally, with the efforts to ramp up that production and everything, the ramping up of that production is only going to happen if the politics actually follow along as well. If the US Congress actually provides funding, if the European Parliament can actually secure its budgets for the supplies to Ukraine, then I think all of that can come together and happen effectively. Of course, those companies aren't going to be investing in massively expensive new production lines if they don't know that the money is going to be there.
And to what extent would the EU, in terms of its own production capabilities, be taking the lead from what Congress in America does? Or to what extent might it say, actually, look, if we can hit a lot of our production targets in 2025, provided America can fill the shortfall this year, if there's a change of administration, if America withdraws support in 2025, we can fill the gap?
I think that there's no way that Europe on its own would be able to make up for the entire volume of munitions that Ukraine would need. So I think if some change of power in the US leads to a significant reduction or even end to support to Ukraine, I think that that's simply a very bad situation. That doesn't put the EU in a position where they can actually take over. The best case scenario, or the minimum scenario, I guess, to maintain the necessary support for Ukraine is really that both Europe and the United States are able to actually get through their hangups and actually continue support at a significant level.
One of the things we've seen, Sim, in recent months is Ukraine sort of steadily falling down the global agenda, in part because of what's been developing in the Middle East, not only in Gaza, but now the situation with the Houthis in the Red Sea. How do you see that affecting what's happening in Ukraine?
That's a very important evolution. It's kind of a reality of having a long war of this kind. I don't want to necessarily compare the Ukraine war with other conflicts in history, because they're all very unique and very different in their dynamics. But in much the same way, when the United States and several of its Western allies deployed into Afghanistan, into Iraq, once you get into an operation that is taking up to a decade instead of a couple months, you get to a point where automatically support for that operation is going to be eroding over time. And I think that's the big challenge for Ukraine, for the parts of the West that want to keep Ukraine successful. It's the difficulty to actually maintain that interest, maintain not necessarily the public's interest, but especially the resolve of politicians who will have to sacrifice, obviously, budgets that are not going to be spent on other things to be able to serve some kind of longer term objective in Ukraine.
And I suppose if you're Vladimir Putin, you were looking at the situation in the Middle East and thinking, well, how can I exploit this? I mean, I believe Iran and Russia are preparing to sign a grand interstate treaty to further develop Russian-Iranian military technological cooperation. I suppose if you're Putin, this presents an opportunity.
Exactly. And distractions on the global theater, that's exactly what Russia has been hoping for, and has even, to some degree, perhaps been trying to instrumentalize. I would even count Russia's activities in Africa, where we saw the whole ordeal between France and Russia in places like Mali, Niger play out in the past few years. All those kind of distractions, they all add to the volume of things that the West has to deal with, that they cannot focus on Ukraine itself. So there's some questions that come out of that. Like, does that make Russia more and more dangerous in some of these places where Russia might actually try to instigate a escalation between Iran and other countries in the Middle East, just as a way to distract the West from the war in Ukraine? But I think the reality is that at the end of the day, a lot of these other actors are also aware of Russia's position, so they'll be trying, I would hope at least, not to shoot themselves in the foot for the sole purpose of helping Russia distract others. I think the Middle Eastern politics that give Iran a certain role when it comes to Yemen and Gaza and everything stands on its own and isn't just an instrument of Russia. But of course, as that is playing out, Russia will try to exploit it as much as it can.
Just to round things off, Sim, what are the key indicators you'll be looking out for in the coming months, which will give us a sense of where this conflict is heading?
So the main thing, of course, is going to be any kind of activity along the front line. We talked about the possibility for new Russian offensives. That's going to be very important to look at. And another thing that I'm particularly focused on is trying to understand what new capabilities Ukraine is able to develop. So as we see, for example, the air defense picture in Ukraine changing as new Patriot systems are coming in, this is changing the way that they are using those Patriot systems. So they've extended their reach in some way by pushing the possible operations of A-50 aircraft out of the Sea of Azov. We've seen them deny airspace near Kherson to some of the fighter bombers that Russia deploys there. So those kind of operations could have a significant effect on the level of pressure that Russia is able to put on the front line. But then we've also got some other things coming in the future, such as the eventual delivery of F-16s, and that's going to raise, or it raises a lot of questions to me at least, and how exactly will they intend to use the F-16, or how will they be able to use the F-16? Will it have a significant impact on the air superiority that Ukraine might be able to project, or will it be something that perhaps could add to the deep strikes that Ukraine has been conducting? So the F-16, of course, could be used to deploy certain long-range missiles to target things like the Black Sea, target airports or air bases inside Russia, things like that. There's a lot of ways that these pieces could be puzzled together, and the way in which Ukraine does that, the way in which they achieve to do that, I think is going to tell us a lot about their actual fighting ability.
Sim Tack, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.